Our talk today is about poverty in Singapore and policy gaps in our social safety net. This talk puts in sharp focus a matter that is of great concern to Singaporeans. We are, by all accounts, a rich country, but we have poor people in our midst. The question is, despite the great progress that Singapore has made and the economic miracle that the PAP government has delivered, why is it that we have left large sections of the population behind? We are here today because it is morally important for us to think about this topic. All of us want a more fair and just society. Singaporeans pledge this on a daily basis. It's actually enshrined in our pledge, a just and equal society. We want that. So the question is, why have we got absolute poverty in Singapore? I'm glad that I'm joined here today by somebody that needs very little introduction. He is well respected and a widely known economist, Mr. Yeoh Keong. Lamphong is an insider because he's worked in the establishment for the longest time. He is an ex-chief economist of the GIC, a position he held for 10 years, and he has been an economist in the GIC for 25 years. And 2 years before that, he was at MAS. So he is a veteran of big picture economic issues that affect Singapore. He knows what he's talking about. At the same time, Yeoh Keong is a very special economist, and if I may say so, he is perhaps Singapore's most compassionate economist, because he has a heart for people in that section of society that have fallen through the cracks. And so, without much further ado, may I invite Lamphong to address us on this very important topic. Lamphong, please. Thank you, sir.
Thank you very much for that very kind introduction, Kush. Thanks very much. First of all, I'd like to thank Dr. Tan Cheng Bok and the PSP for inviting me here to speak tonight. It's an honor. I'd like to also thank Alex and Kush for all the the preparation and the moderation. I'd like to say first of all that I'm usually a non-partisan and independent social, largely analyst and sometimes commentator, and very occasionally an advocate. The reason I'm speaking here tonight at a political party organized gathering, which I don't normally do, is because the topic of poverty, and in particular, measures to eliminate absolute poverty, is a topic very close to my heart. So I'd like to begin, if you like, with a little story to explain to you why this is so important to me personally. Actually, when I worked in GIC, I've been working in GIC, as Kush says, 25 years, for 10 years, sorry, for 20 years, from 1987 to 2007, I never even, to be honest, I never even thought of the poor. I was too involved, I was too caught up in just trying to keep abreast of the work, and trying to help GIC maintain and grow its reserves, being an economist. However, I would say that what happened was that one of the reasons for this was also I was a little disenchanted with economics and social policy because back in 1997, one of my closest friends who's influenced me a lot in life, Mr. Chu King Chuan, who's smiling back there, he was arrested under Operation Spectrum as a so-called Marxist on completely fabricated charges. And I felt so upset by this that I never even thought about politics or social policy issues for 20 years. And then 20 years comes 2007. And another good recent friend of mine, Mr. Donald Lowe, some of you may know him, he was then a rising star in the admin service. He was a DepSec, slated to become soon a PermSec, one of the brightest, they told me, in his generation. He requested that I was about to become chief economist of GIC, help out the government in an interministerial study on poverty. So it was largely then MCYS, MOM, MTI, MOF, and I had to coordinate 4 of these young officers, and we studied it for 2-3 months. And to my shock and horror, I realized that the position of the poor in Singapore, which I had not looked at for 20 years, was really much, much worse and much more awful than I had imagined. So, that struck me. And it all came together one day when I was sitting at a coffee shop. I was living in an HDB flat in Marine Parade, and my son and I, my son was then 12, we were eating at a coffee shop, and I was trying to talk to him, of course. You try and talk to your 12-year-old son. He was totally engrossed in the TV because it was showing Chelsea versus something else. So really couldn't get his attention. So I talked to the guy next to me, Mr. Chan. Mr. Chan had been working in Singapore Changi Airport as a trolley pusher for the last 10 years. He was earning about $700 or $800 a month. So I talked to him, asked him how things were going. I said, how does he make ends meet? And I asked him if he had any kids, if he had any children. At that point, Mr. Chan let out a loud guffaw, laugh, and he said, do you seriously think you can raise children $700 a month? This comment of his broke my son from his football stupor and woke him up. And he realized for the first time that here were people who could not afford to have children like him, right? So he turned to me and he said, hey, Pach, is this true? I said, how many people are like that in Singapore? And I've been doing this study with Donald, so I said, a lot. You know, there's a lot of people like that in Singapore, unfortunately. And he was shocked, and he said to me, Pach, does the Prime Minister know about this? And I said to him, I'm not sure, but I hope so. And that was the honest answer, but we then went on to present our findings, this interministerial group. We presented to the 2 DPMs, we presented to a group of senior ministers, and then we presented to all the PermSecs. This is on Donald's insistence. And it was very well received. So we studied why they were poor, we studied how many poor there were, we studied what could be done about it, how to measure it, which was MCYS's main concern. To be fair, it was an uneven record after that. I mean, the government was open to and opted to do quite a few of those reforms that we recommended, but at a very slow pace, and and leaving many gaps behind even today. And that is what I want to talk to you about. The study then went on. They asked me to go ahead and give this talk to the Civil Service College, where I lectured the LAP, which were the then DepSecs and the directors going, even some members of the current cabinet were my students on this topic, and kind of refined this talk over 5 years. I must have given it half a dozen to a dozen times to the senior civil servants. Again, I got very, very good reviews on it, although subsequently, again, a very, very slow pace of reform. And after that, I've given it to a lot of NGOs, Aware. I've given it to Lian Foundation. I've given it to various people. I've given it to Workers' Party Youth. Like I say, I make an exception for this talk. I would even give it happily to PAP or PAP Youth, but somehow they've never asked me. So here I am, and you're about to hear this presentation, the same presentation, essentially, that all these people, including the cabinet members, past and present, have heard. So I want to share it with you. And it's something very special to me, so here's how it goes. So next slide, please. I want to talk about poverty in Singapore. I want to talk about the poor in our midst, and I want to focus on the social safety net that is needed to lift not just the poor, but the absolute poor, the people, by definition, whose regular income does not enable them to lead a decent existence to cover their basic needs. And what are these basic needs? They are nutritious food, they are a roof over their head, a decent roof over their head, there's enough resources to pay the utilities at a basic level, there's enough resources to send the kids to and from school and them to and from work, and there's enough to pay out-of-pocket expenses for medical services and educational programs in school. That's all. And if you cannot meet these basic needs out of your basic income, then you're below the living wage. You're living in absolute poverty. It's a painful and shameful experience and disgraceful for the rest of society. That's my personal opinion. Okay, so what does it mean? It means that either you or your kids can eat nutritious meals, or maybe not both. So maybe the dad and mom, in between some meals, they cram in a cream bun out of a plastic packet so the kids can have vegetables and meat and a bit of rice, or vice versa. The kids may not have enough to eat at school. They're always hungry. They're always pestering the students, the teachers for biscuits, etc., etc. The free biscuit supply always runs out in the poorest schools. I'm sure those of you who are social workers know this. Okay, it means that on utilities, the kids sometimes don't, the water supply gets cut off, electricity supply gets cut off, they don't have enough. Kids hoard water, they bring water home from school so they can do basic washing. They study with candles or sometimes even kerosene lamps. There have been a spate of fires among our poor Malay community friends called Api Lilin. I don't know if you've heard about that. This is absolute poverty. Some people talk about when they get very sick, they prefer to die than go to hospital and incur even the highly subsidized out-of-pocket costs. This is absolute poverty. How many of our citizens, our fellow citizens, are living in such conditions? I'm sorry to tell you that I think my latest estimate, although the number has been going down, like I say, over the years, is still about 250,000, 250,000 of our fellow citizens. And this is about 110 to 135,000 households, around 7.5% to 10% of our citizen households. I estimate this, because when we recommended back in 2007 that we measure poverty properly in the different kinds of family cluster that occurred, we tracked every year how this cost changed, so we knew the exact numbers. Somehow this recommendation was never taken up. I'm saddened by this because if you don't define the problem properly and exactly, you cannot design, no design of a proper anti-poverty. Are you paying too much? Are you paying too little? Who do you support? Where do you support? How do you support? This becomes open questions. But however, through the research that I've done, I've looked carefully and tried to tease out the data from the general household survey once every 5 years and the recent household survey every 2 years, and patching them together, I've estimated these numbers that there are three categories of poor. First, there are the working poor. You can see that first category. 65 to 70,000 households, 75,000 households, in which even though one member is fully employed, the family as a whole is below, is unable to meet its basic needs. That's the definition of the working poor, below the living wage. And this is roughly, according to my rough measurements, about 500 per capita or less for a 3 to 4 person family. And if you look at the recent work by Prof. Ng Kok Ho, you may have heard of his recent work in NTU, and Teo Yu Yen, who wrote This is What Inequality Looks Like. They've recently done small group focus studies that have calculated what it costs a single person elderly family to live, single person to live at a decent level. They estimated at 1,379 per month, but that includes modest holidays and entertainment. I've taken that out because that is not basic needs to me. I'm quite cruel about that, I'm sorry. But it comes down to a minimum of $1,000 per month for a single household. If I take out from Yen's 1,379 for single elderly and 1,722 for a single young, I'm discounting it to 1,000. And even then, we have these numbers. 25, we have these numbers that you see, right? 70,000 households. And this is after receiving current workfare income supplements and current silver support schemes. And I'll tell you why in a moment, okay? So we have to thank Yu Yen and Kok Ho for doing this research. This is research that should have been done in 2007 and carried on to today, but has not. Okay, but there have been improvements in other ways. The WIS has increased, etc. So the government has done some of it, but I'll try and define how much of it still needs to be done. Now, on top of this bottom 10%, there exists another 10% who are earning up to 3,000 plus a month households, but between all the needs, 2,005 to 3,000, but between all their needs, they have very little savings. They can have just enough more for educational needs, a bit of tuition, they pay for the Wi-Fi bills, the internet, they pay for enough to give their kids a stake in the social mobility game, but they make no savings. And if anything happens to them, they go straight down to the bottom 10%. Okay, so let's move on to the next slide. So that first category I want to focus on is the working poor. Again, about 70,000 households after receiving WIS. And one of the reasons is WIS, which was a great scheme. The government did well to institute that scheme. It was in fact introduced by my friend Donald Low, accepted by the cabinet in 2007. They started off with $100 and $150 a month, and I'm happy to report to you they've moved that up over the years and a lot of egging to $250 to $300 a month. So that's good. Unfortunately, 60% of that is in CPF. So in terms of dollars per month of cash, it's $100 to $150 cash to people who need something like $700, $800 cash. Okay, so yes, they've moved in the right direction, but in my humble opinion, pitifully little. And one of the reasons is I feel they don't have a handle on how much. They need to raise it because they did not measure it properly. Back to the original measurement problem. Okay, so now CPF, you qualify for WIS. These days, you earn less than 2.3, I believe. That's the latest income ceiling. And those are the amounts. Now, in addition to that's not all WIS, the government gives a fair bit of money away in largely ComCare. You've heard of ComCare? ComCare is the next single biggest giver of aid to the poor. And they give roughly 40,000 families something like $270 a month per family. Now, that's good news because there's an additional $270 a month for people who need it. But that's not enough good news because there are people need $700 to $800, you're giving them $270, and there are 120,000 people, you're giving it to 40,000 people. So they're denting the problem, but barely. They're covering about 25% of the gap. Okay, so this is not just a gap, it's a bit more than that. I'll talk about that a bit later. So what is the needed reform? I mean, there are also other schemes, as Dr. Tan well knows. There are rebates, utilities, there are GST vouchers, and you add all of them up. They go a bit further along the way, but we still are only talking about covering 1/3 of the problem. There's 2/3 of the problem unaccounted for. The needed reform, therefore, in this sector for the working poor is to increase a very good WIS scheme. It does not disincentivize work. In fact, incentivizes it because you don't get it unless you work. Increase it by at least $500, $600 cash per month. Right? We need to do this going forward. Now, this will automatically raise the median income of these people in absolute poverty to above the living wage. To above for a four-family, at least around close to $2,000, $1,800, $2,000. It will raise it, and also for our single-person family, closer to or a two-person family, closer to what they need. This will ensure that the basic needs of the working poor are largely covered, not completely, but largely covered. Okay, now what will it cost? Now first, why do we have the working poor? Kush was asking me, why? It's an enigma, right? We have probably the highest per capita GDP in the world. So why is the richest country in the world got so many working poor? Well, the reason is, aside from the normal international reasons like competition from third world or technology, the main reason is actually that for about 20 years, we made a big policy error. In Singapore's growth, we had a go for growth policy, which let in excessive unskilled immigration. So we let in for a period of 20 years, the 90s and first years of the 2000, 2010, 1.2 million unskilled foreign workers. And they pushed down simple labor supply and demand, dampened the wages of people right at the bottom. So if you go to New Zealand, which has only half our per capita income, or Australia, you'll find that the bus drivers, the working men, the factory workers, people, the salespeople there, construction workers, they make a living wage. They earn equal to or perhaps significantly above the living wage. They are not in absolute poverty, but we are because of this big policy error. I therefore think we have recognized this error. 2010, Tharman Shanmugaratnam, he led the Economics Review Committee, and they recognized that we cannot have this excessive immigration anymore, right? So we've stopped it since 2010, and since then, if you look at the latest statistics, real wages have been rising. But it will take too long to rise back to the level above, and 50% more, 70% more, back to the living wage. It will take 10 years, maybe. And what are the poor going to do in that 10 years? Suffer for 10 years more? So, that is why it is, because of it, I feel that because it was a policy error, it is incumbent upon government to step in and support these people until real wages rise, which they will with productivity growth, and therefore support them until we reach that level at which they are no longer in poverty. And this can be done through WIS, through $500 to $600 a month, and it will gradually taper. The numbers should gradually taper off over the next decade as more and more people gradually earn the living wage. So it's not a permanent expense. But how much does it cost? The additional cost is about $1.7 to $2 billion a year, or less than 0.5% of GDP. It is eminently affordable. We can eminently afford to pay this on a declining rate over the next 10 years. Next slide, please. The next group of people I need to talk about are the elderly poor. These are the poor people that you have heard more about because you see them pushing cardboard on the streets, and there's this big debate about whether they're doing it to to work out, or they're doing it because they, they need the money. I can assure you they need the money. And I think there are about 20 to 25,000 such households, just based on using half of those, only half of those who have the basic, who do not have the basic retirement sum. So I've taken all those retiree households who do not have the basic retirement sum, not the full retirement sum, the basic retirement sum, and I've assumed only half of them are absolute poor. This is a conservative estimate. I've assumed the other half are supported by their kids, or somehow or the other they get by from other handouts. So there are 25,000 such households, and the bad news is that over the next 30 years, this will treble. The reason that this will treble is because demographically, the baby boomer generation, which is the biggest population cohort in our demographics, is going to retire. And there's a big bunch of poor people who are about to retire. Now, a lot of these poor people, for example, in my generation, I'm a baby boomer, I'm 62. My colleagues in primary 6, only half of them passed PSLE. Only half of them went on to secondary school. The rest went back to the workforce, right? So a lot of them are very poorly educated to start off with, and therefore have been earning unskilled wages through the whole of their careers. They never went to secondary school. These are the baby boomers. Of course, now it's better, but this bunch still didn't have education. Secondly, for most of their working lives, at least half, they were in a middle-income country. At that time, Singapore was still developing. So they earned middle-income wages for half of their careers. And in the second half of their careers, they ran into this depressed wages scenario that we created out of our policy era. And so they are retiring in the most expensive, one of the most expensive first world cities in the world. How to retire if you've been working all your life in a middle-income country and have had your wages repressed. Now, this is a big issue because it's a hugely growing number, right? These are people that built modern Singapore with their hands and their blood and their sweat and their tears. If we cannot find it in ourselves to see that it's a great social injustice that these people should retire in poverty, absolute poverty, there is something deeply wrong with this society. So, what is the needed reform? The existing very good policy again, they introduced in 2011, the Silver Support Scheme. I've got it wrong, there's not the Silver Scheme, the Silver Support Scheme. It's what we call in economics a non-contributory pension. You don't contribute, but you get a pension. They first got $200 a month, $600 per quarter. Now they're getting $750 per quarter, 1 2-room flat, $250 a month. Very good, very well done. Excellent that it's introduced. However, way too little. What did Yeoh Yuan say you need? She said you need 1,200 per person. I'm saying let's try for 1,000. Let's try for 800. Okay? Let's try for basic needs at least for these people, for these pioneers who built Singapore. And we also have a public assistance scheme, right? They're quite generous. They give $500 a month. But unfortunately, they only give it to 5,000 households. And then we have Comcare, but then again, it reaches only 1/3 of all the absolute poor households. So again, 2/3 of the problem is not addressed, right? What do we need to do? We need to increase the Silver Support Scheme. It's a good scheme, it's already there. It's all we need to do is put in more money, 500 to 600 more extra per month, and this will bring to most of them to the 1,000 per capita or 800 per capita for a 1-person to 2-person retiree family, respectively. This is only 2/3 of Yeoh Yuan's recommendation. Okay? What is the additional cost? The current cost is small, only 0.2, 0.3% of GDP, $800 million to $1 billion. But as the elderly poor increase, I told you they will treble, the cost will treble to 0.6% of GDP by 2050. But again, eminently affordable. Okay, next slide, please. The third group of the absolute poor are, of course, the unemployed poor. And these are the low-income people who get unemployed, not the PMETs. I'm excluding the PMETs here. When the low-income people get unemployed, they are largely living in absolute poverty. They have no savings, they live from hand to mouth. Okay, so this is about 25 to 35,000 households based on the latest unemployment numbers. Now again, think about it in the future. The future, we all know, and most of the good labor market economists tell us, is going to have much higher technological unemployment, right? Artificial intelligence and infocomms technology is going to make redundant a large number of both professionals as well as unskilled workers. Our children will be living in a gig economy. A gig economy means that you go from contract to contract, uncertain contract to contract, some better, some worse. Hopefully the lot stitched together to give you a decent living, but maybe it won't. And there are transitions, many, many transitions between all the gigs. And that is where we need and will encounter an increasing number of the unemployed poor because of the trends in the world economy. And we are not future ready for these trends because Singapore is alone in not having any unemployment insurance among OECD countries. Okay, so what do we need? We need, now there is Concorde short to medium term assistance, but then again, as I've told you, covers only about a third, it's not automatic. A lot of people fall between the cracks. We need a national comprehensive unemployment protection system, either insuring you for 3 months wages to give you a chance to look for a job, 3 months to 6 months. I recommend 3 months. And, or at the very least, if you want to go further, allow them to borrow from their own CPF. If you're unemployed, you should have a right to borrow for 3 months from your own CPF, and when you get a job, you pay back. You're not allowed to do so. In absence of an unemployment insurance scheme, surely this is your money. You should have access to it when you are unemployed and need it. Right? So these two, either one, insurance or borrowing from CPF, are national unemployment insurance comprehensive schemes. The word is comprehensive. We need it because the future is coming at us really fast. Now, this will automatically give people the amount they need, and it will also give them the means to spend, and therefore it is an automatic stabilizer for the economy during recession. And during recessions is when we will need this most, right? Like now. The additional cost will be about 0.4% of GDP to 0.3% of GDP. So that's not much. So let me sum up what the gaps are. Even after WIS, even after the Silver Support Scheme, which are good schemes, even after all the rises that have taken place, there are still 100 to 130,000 absolute poor, 8 to 10% of households, 250,000 of our fellow citizens. All the other schemes added up together after that to fill the gap, Comcare largely, public assistance, GST vouchers, all the various subsidies that you can think of, all the various schemes, MCCY, I've forgotten. It's changed so much, sorry, I've forgotten. Has given, MCCY now, has come up with, only cover 65% for 50% more, or 65% of the need for 50%, or 50% of the need for 65%, whatever it is, they only cover 1/3 of it. So people don't fall between the cracks into poverty. People fall into the poverty chasm. In my humble opinion, it's not a poverty gap, it's a poverty chasm. Right? And people don't fall between the cracks into poverty, they fall into the chasm, into poverty, because there is no bridge, there is no safety net across this chasm. Only 1/3 of this safety net is built. We need to build the other 2/3. So therefore we need all three reforms, we need raising WIS by $500 to $600 a month, raising SSS by $500 to $600 a month, having a basic unemployment insurance system where you can at least borrow from your own CPF. We will meet all the cash basic needs of the working poor, largely, not all. We will meet 80% of the cash needs of the working poor, 80% of the cash needs of the unemployed poor, 80% of the cash needs of the elderly poor will be met. And they will be met, and this bridge, which has too long and too far not been connected, will be built at last. And this will automatically give them, without having to apply and reapply endlessly individually for this assistance. It will eliminate falling into the chasm. The fate of our poor is to fall into the chasm currently. It will eliminate the fate of having to fall into the chasm. It will eliminate what you call this bandwidth problem and this dignity problem. The bandwidth problem is the problem that the poor do not have the focus or concentration to apply to all these schemes. They're too concerned with getting the next meal. You go and try and apply to all these schemes when you're concerned whether your kid can have tuck shop money the next day. Okay, so it reduces, by doing so and eliminating all these small schemes, you will reduce discretionary administration costs a lot. You will also eliminate this terrible thing which is called family-based means testing. So right now, before you receive a lot of these schemes, they check with your mother, why is your mother not giving you, why is your sister not giving you, why is your son not giving you, why is your brother not giving you. So I have a story about this. I was introduced by Mr. Chan, the airport attendant I met, to his friend Mr. Tan a short while later, Marine Parade outside the community center where I live. Mr. Tan has been unemployed chronically for the last 10 years. He was an electrician. He can't seem to make ends meet. And I said, how do you survive? He says, I have no money except my brother gives me a little bit now and then. So I said, how do you survive? He said, I have a strategy. My strategy is called the Lek Tao strategy. What is the Lek Tao green bean? What is the Lek Tao strategy? Just I buy a lot of Lek Tao. It's the cheapest thing around. I put it in a pot and I boil it and I keep it at the back of my stove so that when I need to eat it, I reboil it again and kill all the germs. I eat Lek Tao, so I'm no longer hungry. This is my strategy. I said, are you crazy? Why don't you go and ask the government for some assistance, some money? He says, I will not ask the government because they will ask my mother who can't afford it, my brother who can't afford it, my sister who can't afford it, and my other brother will make fun of me. Okay, so in my humble opinion, the Lek Tao strategy should be a thing of the past. This also avoids the politicization of welfare, which I'm glad to see that the government is reforming. I do not think the CDC should be the administrators and the dispensers of welfare. It should be the ministries, because you're attaching the dispensation of welfare benefits to a political party. That is a slippery slope. Then people will just will either offering too much or giving too little welfare, right? You're hostage to the political fortunes, and you should not be. You should be based on need. So the total cost of all these three reforms, increasing WIS, increasing SSS, $500, $600, putting in a decent national unemployment protection system. The total cost is about $4.5 billion today, or around 1% of GDP. It will increase by 0.5% of GDP as the elderly age, but it should also decrease as the working poor become better off over the next 10 to 20 years. So it's about 1% of GDP. So can we afford it? We have a structural budget surplus, which is about the IMF, which is one of the most conservative financial administrators in the world, estimate at about 5% of GDP, or $20 billion. So we have $20 billion to spare, but we cannot spend $4.5 billion, $5 billion on our absolute poor. Okay, next Next slide, please. So there are other necessary, some supplementary reforms, although this, what I mentioned was the last of it, was the bulk of it. These are necessary supportive reforms. We need more decent, affordable, subsidized rental flats. They're not enough. So not enough, that means two families squeeze into one family, they quarrel, they leave. A certain proportion, not insignificant, ends up homeless. We need adequate infrastructure and subsidies for universally affordable, out-of-pocket, chronic primary healthcare and long-term healthcare. Our healthcare now is universal only in acute hospital care. In terms of chronic primary care for dialysis, for diabetes treatment, for hypertension, in terms of looking after you for stroke, out of the hospital, or any of the long-term care that all of us will face, which is very expensive, we do not have it. We're the only OECD country that does not have it. They're making an attempt. They're starting with CareShield. They're starting with ElderShield. That is good. I applaud them. Again, way too little, way too late. It should have been done 10 years ago. We need subsidies on educational out-of-pocket costs. We need more biscuits, tins, and we need more kids who are poor eating proper meals. We need subsidies on public transport for the poor to get to work and back, and the kids to get to school and back. And for a proportion of the poor who rely entirely on the nest egg of their HDB flat, we need leasehold reform. This is a different complex subject. We'll not touch on it today, but it needs to be looked into. Last slide, please. So this is the conclusion. Eliminating absolute poverty in Singapore. Now, the core of absolute poverty is the most, to me, the most painful and shameful form of poverty, can largely be eliminated easily, affordably, but needs a few key government reforms. Raising those costs, raising those payouts, WIS, SSS, unemployment benefits, is simple. It will make a huge difference to 250,000 citizens, right at the bottom. It will increase social mobility and equal opportunity to these people, to this 250,000 citizens. The heavy lifting of eliminating poverty will be done for the VWOs. Our VWOs are doing a great job. They're going all out. They're getting a lot of volunteers, and Singaporeans are very compassionate. They're giving to VWOs on quite a wide scale. But the VWOs do not have the resources of $4.5 billion a year to do the heavy lifting. And they're spending all their slim resources in doing the heavy lifting that should have been done by the government. The government doing it will enable and free up the resources of the VWOs to do their really value-added stuff, which is the soft side, the soft skills, very important, the dignity side of things, the encouragement side of things, the upskilling side of things, the talking to the delinquent side of things, the rehabilitating the ex-prisoner side of things, the human touch that restores dignity to the poor is the province of the VWOs. The government cannot do this properly, but they are not being enabled to do this. They are using up all their resources and doing the basic stuff that the government should have been doing. We can easily afford it. In eradicating absolute poverty is a public good, therefore, like building roads, like building hospitals, like building schools, that the government needs to do the heavy lifting for financially and organizationally. So what are we waiting for? Thank you.